Hey guys, imagine waking up in a place where the air smells like a mix of rotten fish, baked clay, and human sweat. Sounds delightful, right? Well, that's pretty much what it was like to live a day in ancient Egypt. Spoiler alert, your modern Netflix binge wouldn't save you from the reality of churning river boats, scalding desert heat, and the kind of hygiene practices that make today's biodegradable look like a spa day. Before we dive into just how brutal life could be back then, hit that like button if you love history's gritty side. And let me know in the comments if you think you'd survive a single day without running water or air conditioning. Now, get comfortable or don't, because relaxing probably wasn't in the ancient Egyptian handbook. And let's jump into why you'd be out of luck trying to survive in that ancient sandbox. When Lena stepped onto the sandy, sun-baked banks of the Nile, she was struck by the relentless warmth that seemed to radiate from every grain of dust. The air was thick with the scent of ripe papyrus and baked earth, and distant voices called softly over the water, blending into a quiet hum of daily life. She looked around at the hurried figures, some measuring grain, others tending to livestock, all moving with a sense of purpose that felt both ancient and sleepy. A nearby scribe, his face half shaded by a linen hood, watched her with mild suspicion, eyebrows raised at her outsider's curiosity. It was an environment painted in quiet routine, where each small movement carried the weight of countless silent years. And Lena's naive excitement quietly faded into a hesitant awe as she tried to ask questions about the land. The heat grew more oppressive, sealing her speech within a haze of sweat and exhaustion. The scribe, named Khepri, shifted his weight, eyeing her with a calm but cautious patience, warning her softly about the unforgiving sun that could crack stone and the dangers lurking in the water. Unseen currents, disease-carrying insects, and the sickness that whispered from unseen corners. His words carried a tone of weary practicality, like a reminder that this place, magnificent in its history, was also a landscape of harsh realities. Lena's enthusiasm dimmed further as she realized her picture of ancient Egypt, shaped by stories and images, was already slipping into the slow, deliberate rhythm of survival. The world felt heavier, more serious, and yet strangely mundane in the way all human endeavors do. An irony settled quietly like dusk. The more she looked around, the more she saw the ordinary details that kept the civilization humming. A worker resting against a broken column, a child watching her with wide, bored eyes, two artisans sharing a simple meal in the shade. The splendor of temples and hydrological marvels seemed distant. Here, life was about small, careful acts amid the unending sun. Khepri's voice, once cautious, now sounded mildly amused as he pointed out a faltering papyrus scroll its edges frayed from too much handling. The prophecies and grand stories blurred into a shadowed, indistinct background behind the everyday bustle. Lena felt both humbled and oddly comforted by this slower, more human pace that somehow made the ancient world seem playful in its patience. As the day folded into cooler hours, the harsh brightness softened into a gentle glow that cast long shadows over the riverbank. Lena sat quietly with her palms resting on her knees, feeling the weight of history settle over her like a well-worn blanket. Khepri continued his quiet tasks, now discussing the routine rituals of everyday life. The way people cleaned themselves with moist cloths, the slow process of preparing bread, the careful weaving of linen. Their conversation was a soft hum, blending into the sounds of water lapping at the reeds, animals settling for the night, and distant footsteps echoing softly on cracked stone. The tension of her departure from modern comfort began to ease, replaced by a calm acceptance of the ancient rhythm. An understanding that this world, for all its struggles, was built on the patience of countless small moments. In the quiet after sunset, Lena realized that she had come here seeking discovery, but found instead a quiet meditation on human endurance and simplicity. She watched as the figures around her moved with gentle purpose, their faces blurred by the fading light, absorbed in their little routines, nothing hurried, everything quietly meaningful. Khepri's words, now slowed to a whisper, lingered like a subtle reminder that even in a land of great monuments, the real truth lay in the ordinary, daily persistence of the people. She felt the slow, peaceful inevitability of history's quiet stories, unwritten and enduring, like the eternal flow of the river itself. And so, her fleeting visit dissolved into a long, sleepy reflection on how little has changed in the subtle human need to simply carry on. In the quiet pre-dawn hours of ancient Egypt, Lena set out to explore the bustling market. The air was thick with a subtle warmth already building, sunlight just beginning to seep over the horizon. She moved among stalls offering dried figs, woven baskets, and fragrant spices, her skin already feeling the initial tease of heat. The day promised to grow hotter, as history quietly reminds us that the sun's early rays often carried a relentless, unspoken promise of discomfort. Yet she pressed on, comforted by her small water flask, unaware of how quickly hydration would become more than just a comfort. It would be a necessity. The scene was simple, a human curiosity in the face of an ancient, indifferent heat, as if the sun itself was already tiring of the effort required to burn so fiercely. As the morning stretched onward, the sun climbed higher, and Lena began to notice the subtle shift. The warmth had transformed into a dull, persistent blaze that seeped into her bones. Her skin prickled uncomfortably, and dry lips made swallowing feel like a small, relentless effort. The market's shadows grew thinner, and each breath felt heavier with dust and heat. She reached for her water, only to realize that the supply was dwindling faster than anticipated, an irony. They lacked refrigeration or any easy way to keep water cold, and the tap was long gone. The warm stone beneath her feet seemed to pulse with heat, echoing her growing discomfort. At that moment, she understood that survival here was not guaranteed, merely a fragile act of endurance, balanced on a knife's edge of basic necessity. A quiet, ironic hum settled over the scene as Lena's desperation rose. Vendors offered not water, but dried herbs and dates, items that felt distant from relief. A silent, blurred figure of a priest or prophet passed by, their face hidden in shadow or light, perhaps contemplating the same unyielding sun that now pressed down on her. She wondered if those ancient Egyptians, with their lack of refrigeration, truly understood dehydration, or the thin line between life and the desert's fury. The reality settled into a mundane, yet absurd fact. Without modern comforts, each day's small challenge was an act of calculated risk, a dance around the deadly sun that refused to pause. The market's lively sounds only underscored the quiet irony that in a place of great civilization, survival was still a daily, almost humorous struggle against sun and heat. Eventually, Lena found a shaded corner, leaning her back against a cool stone wall, her breathing slow and measured. The urgency did not quite fade, but it softened into a patient, almost resigned calm. She watched others move with slow familiarity, vendors offering water cloths, children playing in the dust, old men resting while they could. The oppressive heat remained, but human routines continued without flourish or exaggeration. She discovered that even in such hardship, life persisted in small, unremarkable moments, silent victories in the face of relentless sunlight. Her body cooled as the shadows lengthened, and a gentle breeze stirred, carrying whispers of an ancient patience. This moment, simple and unremarkable, invited a quiet reflection. Perhaps humans had always learned, in their own slow, subtle way, to accept the quiet futility of fighting against the sun's unending fury. As the day wound down and the sky softened to a warm beige, Lena reflected on her brief encounter with ancient Egyptian living, how their resilience was woven into daily routines, often unnoticed and taken for granted. The unrelenting sun remained above, indifferent and wise, casting a gentle glow over centuries of abandoned plans and forgotten struggles. She realized that survival was never about conquering the sun, but about learning the art of quiet endurance and small acceptance. In the calm after the storm of heat, there was a sense of shared human humility, that no matter how advanced or fragile, every life was a whisper against eternity, a fleeting moment beneath the great golden gaze. And as she turned to leave, the silent, blurred figures of prophets, traders, and farmers all seemed to nod in knowing. Humans don't last long against the steady, tired sun, but in their small, everyday acts, they endure just long enough. In the quiet corners of ancient Egypt, one might imagine the stillness of days passing beneath the warm sun, where people moved with deliberate patience through life's small routines. Lena, a traveler from a distant land, found herself wandering near a dilapidated quarter where the air carried an unspoken heaviness, an unwelcome mixture of dust, decay, and the faint scent of open-air mummification. The streets were lined with broken pottery and discarded linen wrappings, the sounds muffled under the weight of time and neglect. As she paused to seek shelter beneath a weathered palm, the oppressive atmosphere crept into her lungs, whispering of unseen dangers. It was an environment where the boundary between life and death seemed tinted by the thick, lingering miasma, and the unwary could easily stumble into unseen peril. Soon, Lena's body began to ache with a dull, persistent fever. Her limbs felt heavy, and her forehead burned under the relentless sun. The crowded, unhygienic streets offered little comfort, and her efforts to find help were met with vacant, indifferent faces, some blurred by shadows or hidden behind simple cloths. The knowledge of medicine was fragmentary at best, with doses of bitter herbs and a few distracted healers more focused on ritual than remedy. Tiny parasites, unseen but constant, burrowed beneath the skin of the city's dwellers, spreading sickness beneath a thin veil of ignorance and neglect. In that dusty, feverish haze, Lena understood that her brief walk into this forgotten quarter might transform into a slow, inevitable surrender to the silent, persistent collapse of health. Irony lingered in the air here, amid the remnants of a civilization obsessed with eternity through mummification. The living suffered quietly from decay of a far more insidious kind. The smell of dried resins and embalming oils clung to the air, now replaced by the musty scent of sweat and sickness. The local folk, stoic and resigned, continued their daily chores with a kind of resigned humor, perhaps seeing the universe's small cruelties as part of the natural order. Lena's fever intensified, her vision blurred with the shadows of unseen parasites, the blurred faces of prophets and pharaohs, whose faces seemed forever hidden or obscured by the distant light. And yet, Amidst this slow decay, life persisted in its mundane, unhurried rhythm, quietly indifferent to the suffering that flickered briefly across her consciousness. Eventually, Lena settled into a calm resignation, her thoughts drifting like a soft breeze through the quiet streets. She watched the simple acts of life: a woman selling water, a child playing with a broken pottery shard, an old man blinking slowly beneath a broad-brimmed hat. The city's faded beauty revealed itself in these small, unremarkable moments, an unspoken dignity in everyday routines. Her fever finally broke, and with it, a sense of gentle detachment from the chaos of health and sickness. She realized that in this land of enduring monuments and silent prophets, the human body was just as vulnerable as the fleeting moment of a restless breeze. The ancient walls, once meant to preserve eternity, now stood quietly as witnesses to fragile, passing lives. Looking back, Lena understood that her brief encounter with this ancient world was also a quiet lesson in humility. How the grandeur of a civilization cannot shield its people from the simple, universal truth of impermanence. The miasma, the parasites, the limited remedies, all small reminders that human imperfections persisted through ages, often hidden beneath a veneer of eternal achievement. As she continued her journey away from the decaying quarter, she carried with her a muted awareness that even in times of apparent greatness, life's fragility is ever present, and the quiet, ironical endurance of ordinary people remains, somehow, both poignant and profound. And so, the ancient city's stillness lingered in her mind, an unspoken acknowledgement of human impermanence in a world that never quite finished decaying. In the quiet warmth of a late afternoon, the marketplace bustled gently, and Lena, a foreign visitor with a small bundle of cloth and a curious gaze, found herself summoned by a stiff, slow-moving official. The decree had come subtly, yet immediately: orders for all outsiders to report to the Grand Palace, where cold stone corridors awaited. Lena's shoulders tensed ever so slightly, her breath catching at the gravity of the summons, as footsteps echoed around her. Indifferent and unhurried, she hesitated, feeling an odd mix of excitement and dread settle in her chest, knowing this moment was the start of something unspoken and unanticipated. The sun slipped a little lower, casting long shadows across the street as she followed the guards with quiet steps and an unspoken question lingering in her mind. Inside the palace, the air grew still and heavy with the scent of old stone and faint incense. The officials, faces blurred by shadow and distant light, scrutinized her with slow, measured expressions, their voices echoing in the vast, silent hall. Lena was asked questions about her origins, her purpose, her loyalties. Each word weighed like a pebble dropped into a deep well. The process was relentless, yet dispassionate, as if her individuality was merely an event to be catalogued. She felt her palms grow clammy, her thoughts racing to find something convincing, something indeterminate to hold onto. But the weight of judgment pressed down gently, if persistently. All the same, hours fell into a quiet, unchanging rhythm that seemed to stretch into eternity. Irony lingered like a faint dust in the air. Here she was, detained and questioned, yet surrounded by the opulence of a civilization that thrived on the quiet persistence of routine. Her words, spoken carefully, seemed to dissolve into the space between syllables, while the officials, a blurred mosaic of veiled intentions, continued their meticulous inspection, indifferent to her anxiety. Forced labor was hinted at softly, like an old passing joke from a distant past, yet the threat hung faintly behind their measured tones. Lena, with her heart no longer pounding, instead drifted into a strange calm, observing her own breath and the muted colors of the sandy halls, recognizing the stark ordinariness of power dressed in routine. In this muted dance of authority, she glimpsed human smallness beneath the grandure's veneer. As days settled into a slow, predictable rhythm, Lena's initial tension faded into a quiet acceptance. She learned the soft sounds of the palace, faint footsteps, the rustling of papyrus, the distant hum of courtyard life. The sun rose and set with gentle consistency outside, and her thoughts drifted, unhurried, towards memories and mundane hopes. The officials occasionally returned, their expressions still tired and blurred by shadow. Yet now their questions seemed less piercing, more like a distant echo from a world she once knew. The moment for decisive judgment, the culmination of her ordeal, loomed like a distant thunder that never quite arrived. There was a strange comfort in her calmness, in recognizing that even in captivity, life persisted in quiet, ordinary ways. In the softness of that evening light, Lena sat quietly within the cool, shadowed chamber, reflecting on her ordeal. Her body was weary, but her mind strangely clear, recognizing the subtle ironies of power and the fragile cloth of loyalty she was asked to wear. The faces she glimpsed had remained blurred, unseen by her, yet somehow seen in her own quiet awareness. She thought of distant lands and the fleeting nature of authority, how fleeting and fragile such moments truly were. Perhaps, she realized, the honest human experience was often found in ordinary patience, in the muted stories of everyday life that nobody ever wrote down. As she slowly fell into a light sleep, the palace's silent heartbeat continued on, an ancient reminder that human stories, even under great power, are woven from small, quiet threads. In the quiet glow of dawn, Lena found herself standing at the edge of a vast desert, the sun casting a pale gold light over the shifting sands. The air was warm and still, the faint sound of distant breeze barely stirring the surface of the dunes. Her only company was the muted hum of her own breathing and the distant, unseen eyes of the ancient landscape. It seemed peaceful enough, yet beneath that calm lay the harsh reality, a world designed to consume the unprepared, where survival depended on secrets and silent knowledge passed down through ages. As she hesitated, the faint outline of a small, weathered tunnel entrance appeared beside her, whispering promises of escape rooted in forgotten ways. Stepping through the narrow passage, Lena's skin prickled with the cool shock of shadow and the gritty texture of the earth beneath her fingers. The tunnel twisted and dipped, echoing faintly with the distant drip of water and the rustling crawl of unseen creatures burrowing below. The darkness pressed in, and her muscles grew tense with the effort of moving silently, cautious of any unexpected noise or sudden collapse. Every step was a fragile gamble, silent and slow, each one a reminder of how fragile her human frame was against the relentless demands of this underground refuge. Exhaustion crept into her bones, yet she pressed on, drawn by the faint hope of slipping free into some distant certainty. Finally, with a quiet shudder, she emerged into the blinding glare of the midday sun, the bright sky an indifferent witness to her escape. Her eyes blinked against the surge of light, and she paused by the entrance, watching the desert stretch endlessly in all directions. The wind carried fine grains of sand that settled into creases of her skin and caught in her hair, a reminder of the relentless power of nature's indifferent hand. As she took a breath, she couldn't help but notice the peaceful, almost amused stillness of the scene, the way the ancient sands seemed to wait patiently, unbothered by human struggles and stories. Here, in this moment, she understood how fleeting such turbulent efforts to survive truly were amidst the timeless silence. Standing amidst the quiet dunes, Lena let out a slow breath, her body relaxing as the sharp edges of her recent ordeal softened into memory. She considered how the ancient Egyptians, who had thrived in this land, had also known the cruel rhythm of exhaustion and danger. Their lives woven into the endless cycles of heat and hardship. Every day must have demanded a patience deeper than the eye could see, a strange acceptance of the world's unyielding nature. That faint irony lingered human ambitions, often brushed against the vast, unchanging silence of the desert, which neither cared nor changed. In this calm, paused moment, she saw the quiet dignity of their persevering routines, simple acts, endless effort, and soft humor in the face of timeless adversity. As she stepped through the shimmering heat back into the time rift, Lena felt a gentle, almost amused appreciation for the quiet resilience of those who had come before her. She reflected on how her short escape didn't erase the brutal reality that had awaited her if she had stayed, an existence of patience, suffering, and subtle irony woven into everyday survival. Humans, she thought, are often delicate yet stubborn by nature, caught in the slow dance of endurance. Now, back in the calmer present, she watched the desert's quiet surface, knowing that beneath its stillness lay stories of persistence and silent resistance. With a gentle sigh, she let the thought drift away, feeling the soft hum of history's tired, endless breath. With the dawn barely stirring the air, Neferet's eyes fluttered open to the faint glow spilling through her simple woven blinds. Outside, the Nile's waters lapped softly against the bank, hinting at the slow arrival of what everyone called the Great Flood, though it was neither sudden nor surprising. Her family lay still, wrapped in thin mats, as she quietly moved to prepare the morning porridge, her hands familiar with the slow rhythm of these days. The smell of damp earth and ripening straw filled the small room, a reminder that the land's bounty and its challenge were entwined with the river's gentle rise. Today, as every other day before it, life was both a careful anticipation and a humble acceptance of the waters that shaped their existence. As the sun climbed higher, the waters visibly encroached, whispering softly, almost insistently, against the reeds and the mud walls. Neferet, now tending her children and checking the woven baskets, felt the slight dampness on her sandals more acutely. The villagers often whispered about the flooding, some half amused by its persistent punctuality, others wary of its unpredictable depth. With each rising inch, the irony settled. Their livelihood depended on harnessing and surviving the river's generosity. Yet each year's inundation threatened to swallow what little they possessed without warning. A distant shout from a neighbor echoed faintly over the water, but it was as if everyone simply kept going, accustomed to the slow, unstoppable tide of circumstances. In the quiet of the afternoon, the village's usual hum of activity slowed. Some children played by the embankments, splashing small dances of water, while older women embroidered in the shade. Neferet chuckled softly at her son's mud-streaked face, admired how they continued their routines, as if the flood were just another part of their daily story, rather than a looming disaster. The teachers, elders, even the village prophets, whose faces remained obscured or shadowed, offered only distant, blurry prophecies, their vague faces forgetting clear features against the bright backdrop of the river. The irony lay in the subtlety. Everyone accepted the rise, and fall, believing control, was a matter of patience, even if the waters often proved otherwise. As evening arrived, the sky softened to a warm, golden hue, casting long shadows across the water and the muddy banks. Neferet set aside her worries for a moment, watching her family gather around a small fire, sharing quiet meals in flickering light. The river's slow, rhythmic hum now seemed peaceful, almost meditative, like a lullaby handed down through generations of villagers. In that calm, she found a quiet sense of resilience, acknowledging that while the flood could take much, it also sustained the land and their lives in ways words could not fully capture. The unseen, blurred faces of prophets watched from afar, their vague outlines blending into the fading light, a gentle reminder that no one truly commands the river, only learns to live with it. As night fell over Kenemet, the village was, by some measure, unchanged, perhaps softer, quieter, more introspective. Neferet's thoughts drifted to the future, knowing the waters would return again, gently testing the boundaries of their humble homes. She felt the slow weight of history, threaded through her daily routines, a quiet lesson in humility and endurance. The flood, in its slow, inevitable way, was both a threat and a gift, an ongoing story of survival intertwined with the river's endless, patient flow. Somewhere behind a faint veil of darkness, unseen faces and hidden memories kept watch, their presence blurred, always present, always distant, like the silent, enduring river itself. As dawn's gentle light seeped over the Nile's broad surface, Neferet moved quietly through her humble mud-brick hut, bundled in a simple linen robe. The river's surface shimmered softly, promising a day that would begin with the familiar rhythm of routine, fetching water, inspecting the small plot of wheat, and listening to the distant, low hum of river life. Her hands, roughened by daily labor, carefully checked the few stored grains, feeling the cool, gritty texture of the storage jars. It was a morning like many others, yet beneath the calm surface, the distant sky hinted that change might not wait. Still, she hesitated to read too much into it. The river had its moods, as did life, unfolding slowly with quiet persistence. Around midday, the subtle shifts became more noticeable. The waterline crept higher with an almost imperceptible urgency, swelling faster than the sun's warmth could explain. Neferet hurried to reinforce the clay and reed walls of her home, pressing mud into cracks and stacking broken off bricks carefully along the base. Outside, neighbors' voices drifted in an uneasily overlapping chorus, some worried, others resigned as they moved to evacuate their stored grains and gather what little they could carry. The river's approach was a slow but relentless tide, muddling the familiar landscape with an almost mischievous persistence. In this moment, human plans seemed dwarfed by the quiet, unstoppable rise of the flood. Amid the gathering chaos, a neighbor's voice rose in protest as a small scuffle broke out over the limited space left on the dry patch of ground near the water, an ironic scene in a moment of shared peril. The floodwaters lapped at the edges of their modest homes, yet there was a strange, dark humor in how everyone scrambled, bumping into each other, like children fighting over a single toy. The river, seemingly oblivious to their disagreements, continued its slow, assured climb, swallowing low walls and muddy pathways. Neferet watched in mild amusement and mild frustration as the absurdity of human conflict played out amidst the encroaching water. The inevitability of the flood seemed almost tolerant, patiently waiting while people hurried with half-hearted urgency. As evening settled, a fragile calm returned, the water level stabilizing for the moment and casting everything in a soft, amber hue. Neferet sat outside her home, the grains safely stored in a corner, her brow slightly creased but her breath even. The sky was now painted with quiet streaks of orange and cream, a lull after the relentless noise of the day. The river's murmur was calmer, almost as if it shared their exhaustion, while the stars began to faintly appear above. In this peaceful pause, there was a contemplative stillness, the kind that gently settles when chaos recedes, leaving only the gentle hum of life's slow, repetitive rhythm. It was simply another day, marked by small human endurance amid the vast, patient flow of nature. Later, as Neferet prepared to rest, she reflected quietly on the day's events, reminding herself that life, much like the Nile, always moves forward, sometimes with a gentle swell, sometimes with a roaring tide. The flood had come and gone, leaving behind its patchwork of quiet destruction and minor chaos, each moment a silent testament to human imperfection and resilience. The faces of neighbors, blurred by the dimming light, felt like quiet witnesses to this timeless dance of survival. In these small, uneventful hours, she understood that the true history wasn't written in grand stories, but in the tender, mundane act of securing a home against the slow, steady march of the flood. Tomorrow would come, with its own patience and persistence, as always. As twilight settled over the village, a gentle hush fell, interrupted only by the distant splashing of water against the reed walls. Neferet's family gathered in the communal shelter, their faces dimly illuminated by a flickering oil lamp, shadows dancing softly on woven mats. The sky darkened slowly, and the first signs of floodwaters seeping through the gaps felt like a slow, inevitable sigh in the air. They had prepared for this day, yet the quiet knowledge that everything might change lingered in their eyes, unspoken. A simple meal was shared: dates, cold bread, and a small bowl of chopped herbs, each bite measured and mindful, as if eating could somehow anchor them against the rising tide. Night deepened, and the water's breach became more evident, whispering against the walls with a restless patience. Outside, the sky had turned a slate gray, and distant thunder rumbled with the faint sense of nature's quiet disapproval. The villagers sat closer together, their bodies hunched against the damp cold, eyes flickering between shadows and the encroaching darkness. Neferet's husband traced faint patterns in the dust with his finger, trying to maintain some semblance of calm, while her children pressed their hands into her worn dress, sensing the fragility of the moment. The faint creak of wood and the murmur of water created a lullaby that neither soothed nor disturbed completely, just persisted, soothing in its persistent patience. Irony settled quietly in the form of the village elders, whose faces remained blurred in the flickering light, their voices soft, yet filled with an unspoken humor about the situation. Someone muttered about prophets and omens, though their features were hidden behind shadows, as if the gods themselves had turned away. The water continued its slow, deliberate rise, and a loaf of bread floated briefly past a makeshift wooden support. An old woman chuckled softly at the thought of the local priest's overly serious comments, noting how even the gods might find this all somewhat mundane. Despite the exhaustion, a faint smile passed among them, because even in catastrophe, human patience often finds a dark, small humor. Eventually, the floodwaters reached their highest point, and a strange calm settled over the shelter, as if the chaos had momentarily paused to take a breath. The faces, once anxious, grew quiet and distant, their features relaxed into the slow rhythm of waiting. The water lapped around their knees, cold but bearable, and the air was thick with the scent of wet earth and old linen. Outside, the sky had faded to a soft, washed-out gray, with stars uncertain behind the thickened clouds. In this stillness, there was an odd comfort reminding them that sometimes the world simply moves at a negligent pace, forgiving the hurried human attempt to control it. Sleep seemed like a quiet inevitability, even in the midst of loss. As dawn approached, pale light seeped through gaps in the reeds, casting a muted glow over the battered village. The floodwaters had begun to recede, leaving behind a landscape muffled and softened, like an old photograph slightly faded. Neferet and her family awoke slowly, their eyelids heavy, but minds clearer, the ordeal a slow, shared reflection on resilience rather than disaster. They exchanged few words, tending to the fragile act of reassembling their lives in the quiet aftermath. The faces they saw were faintly amused by their own endurance, touched by the small irony that life's trivial routines persisted even during its most extraordinary moments. And somewhere in the distant, blurred faces of unseen prophets, perhaps a faint smile was hidden in the depths of shadowed corners. As dawn stretched lazily across the Nile, the waterline crept higher, darkening the horizon with a sluggish inevitability. Small villagers awoke to the muffled roar of the flood, the gentle splash of water against the matted reeds, and the occasional drip from the thatched roofs. Neferet, with her simple linen robe soaked at the hem, peered anxiously at the rising tide, her eyes faintly clouded by the fatigue of yet another restless night. The community's modest shelter trembled softly, as if in quiet resignation, waiting without protest. Everything was quiet, except for the distant murmur of water and the soft footsteps of those preparing for what might be another long, slow dayward. By mid-morning, the river seemed to exhale a heavy breath, and the water began to creep more swiftly, threatening to engulf the fragile homes. Neferet moved among her neighbors with precise urgency, her fingers fumbling through sandbags, stacking them with deliberate patience. The villagers responded with a weary kind of cooperation, hands unhurried, faces blurred by the morning light, unseen prophets of their daily hardship. The wind carried a faint smell of damp earth and damp fabric, and the canvas of the levee wobbled slightly under the weight of water, not yet fully arrived. Tension lingered in the air, a silent acknowledgement that nature's slow, steady march was nearing its inevitable peak. In the quiet irony of the moment, a lone figure wandered near the makeshift barricade, an old man with a face half hidden by shadow, silently observing the effort with a slight, bemused smile. Children clasped small stones or twigs, pretending to help, their innocent attempts met with gentle, amused glances from their elders. The flood's advance had become a kind of mundane spectacle, neither catastrophic nor entirely controllable, merely a routine disturbance. The water's whisper seemed almost conversational, as if it had a memory of seasons long past. Neferet paused momentarily, breath shallow, aware of the absurdity that life continued in these small, unremarkable acts, carried out against the slow, unstoppable tide. As the sun reached its highest point with a soft, golden hue, the levee appeared to stabilize. Sandbags pressed firmly against the mud, and the villagers' collective effort brought a rare moment of quiet reassurance. The air cooled slightly, and a gentle breeze carried away the dampness, leaving only the faint scent of wet earth. Neferet's hand rested momentarily on a bag, her gaze softening as she watched children play near the water's edge. Unfazed by the looming threat, the river's gentle swish against the levee seemed to murmur in a calm tone, almost forgiving in its patience. There was a peculiar sense of peace in knowing that today, like any other, the community had shown resilience through a simple act of endurance, an ordinary act of survival. Later, as the sun dipped and the flood receded into a distant memory, the villagers gathered quietly to inspect the levee, their faces weathered but unbowed. The water had left behind traces of its passage, small puddles, smeared mud, and tired smiles, remarkably unremarkable in their quiet dignity. Neferet, now sitting on a low stone, looked out across the quiet waterbed with a faint, tired smile. She understood, in a muted way, that life's small struggles, like the turning of a great wave, carried no grandeur, just steady persistence amid gentle chaos. The river, calm once more, flowed away slowly, leaving behind the tranquil knowledge that order simply endures, quietly, between the waves. As dawn's pale light seeped over the village, the floods had begun their slow retreat, leaving behind a thick layer of silty earth that shimmered softly in the morning sun. Neferet moved quietly among the huts, her hands steady but her eyes contemplative, as if aware of the quiet promise in the receding waters. The river's relentless rise had unsettled many, making the air thick with the scent of damp earth and distant, whispering currents. Still, in these moments before the day's work, there was a strange calm, an acceptance that life was often at the mercy of nature's slow, unremarkable cycles. That silence, heavy yet gentle, carried the weight of stories about resilience that now felt both old and ongoing. Throughout the day, the villagers gathered to clear debris and replant what could still be saved. The sun moved lazily across the sky, casting long, stretching shadows on freshly silted fields. There was a faint tension in the air as worries about future floods lingered like distant echoes, but also a quiet determination rooted in routine. Neferet watched her neighbors work, men with calloused hands rebuilding their irrigation channels, women weaving baskets of dry reeds, each small motion a quiet act of renewal. Still, moments of irony tucked into their labor. The very waters that threatened the harvest were also what fertilized the land beneath their feet, an unspoken acknowledgement of nature's unchanging duality. Later in the afternoon, as the sun dipped lower, a few villagers paused to observe the swollen riverbed, where the water now moved sluggishly, leaving behind a muddy scent and patches of lingering dampness. Children played near the edges, skipping stones and darting after insects, their laughter muted against the expansive, empty sky. A cluster of elders gathered in the shade of a low-pitched tree, their faces blurred by the waning light, exchanging stories in a slow, monotone voice, stories that spoke of hardships turned into hopes, and of how each flood was just another chapter in their quiet history. An old man's gaze lingered on the horizon, where the water had once risen fiercely, as if recognizing the strange comfort in recurring chaos. As twilight settled, the village settled into a gentle stillness, their work done for the day, the fields now quiet under a soft orange glow. Neferet took a moment to rest, her eyes drifting over the freshly silted earth, which shimmered like a promise of future bounty. There was something remarkably peaceful about this slow transition from chaos to calm, a rhythm that had persisted for generations, unspoken but understood. The muted sounds of crickets and the distant call of a night bird filled the air, yet nothing disturbed the contemplative silence. Everyone seemed to accept that renewal came gradually, like the gentle unfolding of night after brightness, a kind of soft, ongoing rebirth. Later, as the village lies in quiet repose, the landscape holds its breath, faint traces of mud and water, the distant outline of reeds and thatched roofs, all bearing the marks of histories in different flow. Neferet stands briefly at her door, observing the gentle darkening, feeling a subdued sense of continuity, an understanding that each flood, no matter how disruptive, simply adds another layer to their shared story. The river, now calm, reminds them of nature's patient rhythm. Chaos and calm, suffering and renewal, all quietly intertwined. With tired eyes and a softened heart, she whispers to herself that tomorrow will come, like yesterday and the day before, quietly promising another chance to rebuild and accept. In the early morning light of Thebes, Khepri, a diplomat from Nubia, stepped quietly into the grand hall of the pharaoh's court. The stone pillars gleamed softly, casting long, lazy shadows on the polished floors, while the air carried a faint scent of incense and faded linen. His eyes briefly flicked over the figures clustered nearby, heads bowed slightly, wary expressions hidden beneath veils of unwelcome curiosity. The courtiers' glances were quick, noting the outsider's modest attire among the richly adorned officials, each movement measured and restrained. It was a silent invitation, and Khepri's heart grew faintly restless, knowing well that this was only the beginning of a long, slow dance of diplomacy, tinged with unspoken tests. As the day unfolded, the tensions in the court subtly thickened. Whispers slipped through the hall like breath on a cool morning, and the high priestess Nefret and vizier Hormheb offered fragmented smiles layered with veiled warnings. They explained with faint, tired gestures that the court's harmony depended on unspoken rules, small nods, measured words, and the careful omission of certain truths. Khepri listened with quiet patience, aware that every gesture held weight. A smile might hide suspicion. A glance could carry judgment. The masks of civility rested heavily, hinting at a fragile peace that might crack at any moment. Should any outsider forget the length and the depth of the court's quiet perils, the evening brought a ceremonial banquet, ostensibly a gesture of welcome, but quietly understood as a subtle test of loyalty. The pharaoh, Amenhotep, presided silently, a figure softened by the flickering light of nearby oil lamps, yet distant, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the table's edge. Servants moved slowly, placing fragrant dishes on brightly embroidered cloths with deliberate care. As subdued music played in the background, barely audible, Khepri found himself caught between the bland taste of the food and the strange, ironic kindness of the pharaoh's smile, which seemed both a greeting and a reminder of the delicate line he must walk in this court, where loyalty was measured not in words, but in silent, unyielding watchfulness. Later, as night slipped quietly over the city, the courtiers dispersed into their chambers, leaving Khepri behind in a quiet, dimly lit hall. He sat for a moment on a simple stool, feeling the rough coolness of the stone beneath his fingertips, reflecting on the strange serenity of the day's careful games, the court's unspoken rules, the ceremonies, the wary smiles, all of it blended into a muted chorus of human fragility. Even amidst the splendor, the underlying exhaustion of keeping one's true thoughts hidden was palpable. He realized that beneath the surface of glittering tradition, this was a place of subtle apologies and guarded hearts, enduring in its quiet, timeless rhythm. As sleep gently claimed the city and the shadows lengthened, Khepri's thoughts settled into a slow, mindful calm. The court's fragile balance persisted, a silent acknowledgement that outsiders, no matter how well-intentioned, were often unprepared for its quiet perils. He understood now that beneath the veneer of grandeur lay a delicate mixture of human imperfection, patience, and restraint. The lessons of the day felt like faint whispers from a distant past, urging him to move quietly through these ancient, careful corridors. Somewhere in the stillness, there was a quiet humor in the absurdity. How much could be hidden in a single glance, and how easily trust could crumble under the slightest weight. In the quiet hours of the late morning, Khepri moved through the bustling courtyards, his eyes absorbing the intricate patterns of the jewel-toned tapestries and the soft murmur of seated guests. The feast sprawled out with fragrant bread and cool wine, a scene of careless opulence under a lazily shining sun. though the air held a faint scent of incense and marigolds. There was a subtle undertone of purpose, an awareness that beneath these meals, something more covert was stirring. Kepri's unfamiliar customs, bowing instead of kneeling, asking questions about the health of the Nile, were met with cautious glances and half-aware smiles. The day unfolded slowly, often punctuated by soft whispers and the rustling of silk as he gently navigated the lavish surface of palace life, unaware of the delicate and quiet dangers woven into its fabric. As the hour grew later, Kepri noticed the eyes, small, fleeting, behind beaded screens, among the embroidered drapes, whose gaze lingered just a moment too long. The atmosphere deepened into something less innocent. An unspoken tension crept over the hall like a slow shadow. He caught snatches of whispered exchanges, the rustle of folded cloth, fingers brushing against concealed objects, a cryptic scarab amulet, cool and rough against his palm, was slipped into his hand unnoticed, its curves and ancient symbols hinting at whispered alliances and veiled threats. The subtle hostility in the court's murmuring seemed to stretch lazily, like the shadow of a passing cloud, quietly undermining his purpose without overt confrontation. Still, he pressed on, sensing the fragile thread holding together this web of quiet deception. With a dry smile, Kepri recognized the irony of his outsider's presence amidst these rigid, unyielding traditions. The court ladies, with their delicate hands and painted nails, viewed his foreign customs, bowing to a statue, asking questions about the harvesting season. Even the way he sipped his drink, as oddities that punctuated the formal rhythm of their days. The perfume of jasmine and papyrus mingled with the faint smell of suspicion, an aroma more familiar than he thought. Amid the slow, steady pulse of carved stone and painted face, a quiet irony persisted. Their meticulously maintained order was a fragile veneer, balanced precariously on centuries of unspoken rules and small daily customs. And here he was, an outsider, quietly unraveling enough of it to see how easily it might all shift and break. As twilight settled, casting a warm orange glow across the palace walls, Kepri found a rare moment of calm, an invitation to sit beneath a spreading fig tree outside the main hall. His hands rested on the stone bench, fingers tracing the cool roughness, while the sounds of distant footsteps and murmured conversations ebbed into a gentle hum. The cryptic scarab, now tucked safely away in his pouch, seemed to rest beside him, its quiet weight reminding him that alliances, once hidden, could be as fragile as a whisper. He observed the gentle shift of light, the slow closing of doors, and the distant, rhythmic beating of a drum. Ordinary moments of stillness amid a complex web of human frailty. In this softened space, he let himself reflect on how superficial the court's grandeur truly was. One more layer of the same silent human condition. In the quiet hours after the palace had settled into a gentle sleep, Khepri sat beneath the stars, pondering the day's remaining truths. The courtiers' whispers, the secretive exchanges, the silent pact represented a fragile human dance, one that thrived on subtlety, misdirection, and unspoken fears. His own customs, seemingly simple, clashed quietly with their unyielding rituals. A slow reminder of how easily human life turns into a delicate balance of trust and suspicion. Behind the blurred face of a prophet or an unseen deity, there was always the same human vulnerability, fear of betrayal, longing for stability, and the slow, calming knowledge that everything, even power, was held together by threads as thin as a scarab's shell. He rose quietly, a matter of small steps, aware that true understanding often required patience and a willingness to accept the slow, imperfect rhythm of human affairs. In the quiet hush of dawn, Khepri, a young official, prepared himself for the ritual that symbolized both faith and tradition. The courtyard was silent, except for the faint shuffle of sandals and the distant murmurs of courtiers observing with measured indifference. Standing at the edge of the sacred lake, he looked down at the smooth, dark surface, which reflected a faint, blurred image of his face, hidden by a veil of morning light. The heat from the sand beneath his feet was gentle, yet persistent, reminding him of the daily small battles humans face with their routines. As he recited the ancient hymn softly, it was easy to forget that this simple act carried the weight of age-old authority and expectation. Suddenly, a brief cloud obscured the sun, flickering across the sky like a restless thought. As a sudden wind picked up, stirring the fine grains of sand around Khepri's feet, the court around him held its breath, waiting for the inevitable misstep, as if a moment of natural slightness could unravel his future. His voice wavered just slightly, a tiny imperfection in the ritual's perfection, causing whispers of suspicion among the spectators. The storm gathered momentum, the sky darkening into a dull gray, and for a moment it seemed perhaps nature itself intended to interfere with human certainties. Khepri hesitated, caught between the desire to finish honorably and the instinct to escape the threatening storm's wrath. Amid the swirling clouds and the rising tumult, an almost ironic sense of stillness crept in. How human plans seem so vulnerable to the whims of weather and chance. The court's watches turned from stern condemnation to a quiet, almost amused patience, as if witnessing a strange, slow dance of inevitability. Khepri, his toes tingling from the cold and heat of the sand, realized how fragile the line was between duty and self-preservation, and how easily it was blurred by petty fears. The hymn still lingered on his lips, though the storm rumbled louder, echoing the chaos of human imperfection. The ritual, once a symbol of divine order, felt now like a fragile paper boat bobbing in a restless sea. With a deliberate breath, Khepri made a quiet choice to step back, lowering himself slightly, but refusing to abandon his post entirely, trusting in the quiet resilience of routine. The storm's noise became a background hum as he gently turned away from the lake's edge, his footsteps soft and unhurried. The clouds parted slowly. The sun's rays touched his face in a hesitant, tender warmth, as if acknowledging the futility of trying to control everything. The court remained still, their faces mostly blurred by shadows or distant, emotionless calm. In that moment, Khepri found a peaceful clarity. Human actions are often modest, and perhaps that was enough to keep faith alive, even amid chaos. Later, as the day settled into a mild haze, the memory of the storm lingered as a quiet whisper in the back of everyone's mind, an unremarkable event that subtly underscored the gentle absurdity of human effort. Khepri returned to his duties, his steps knowing but unassuming, aware that neither heroism nor failure would be etched in his fate that day. The ritual had ended, the court's gaze softened, and life resumed its slow, measured pace. In quiet moments like these, history seemed less like a story about great deeds and more like a collection of small, imperfect attempts to carry on. There was a gentle comfort in accepting that some storms, natural or human-made, pass simply because they do, leaving behind only faint footprints of what once seemed so unchangeable. In the quiet depths of the throne hall, the day's calm had begun to wane, shadows lengthening across the sandstone pillars. When the storm outside subsided, a careless glance revealed a small, glittering pile of stolen gold tucked away beneath a loose stone, a detail unnoticed for months. The news spread softly, like a whisper carried by the wind, an unusual disturbance in the temple of power, where order was supposed to reign. The pharaoh's eyes, usually calm and distant, flickered with a rare hint of worry as he summoned his court to confront the strange, silent discovery. In those moments, the familiar routine unraveled slowly, revealing the fragile veneer of control that underpinned the court's quiet life. As the courtiers gathered, the pharaoh's gaze fixed sharply on Khepri, the outsider who had recently come from distant lands, known for humble work and odd customs. Without much ceremony, he was accused, blamed for conspiring with thieves, perhaps even encouraging their secretings, an outsider's unfamiliarity fueling suspicion. Khepri, a simple scarab handler, listened patiently, his expression mild and undeniably tired, as the accusations washed over him like a slow tide. The air in the hall grew heavier, tension rising like a gentle hum beneath the polite surface. Yet beneath the accusations, a quiet doubt flickered. If outsiders were always to fall apart under suspicion, then the court's veneer of stability was perhaps too thin to last. In an ironic turn, the vizier stepped forward, voice calm, but eyes sharp, revealing that he himself had been involved in the corruption all along. His confession, spoken softly, was laced with a strange, weary humor. There was no need for shouting, no need for fervor, as he admitted to betraying the trust of the court. The glow from Khepri's scarab amulet suddenly flickered with an almost divine light, as if softly affirming some hidden truth. The glow contrasted gently with the dim, warm tones of the hall, a quiet sign that everything was, perhaps, more complicated than simple blame. The scene seemed to pause, as if the moment itself was waiting to see what else lay hidden beneath the surface. The room settled into a strange calm as voices quieted, and the tension ebbed like a slow tide retreating from sandy shores. Khepri's face remained composed, touched only by the faintest hint of irony at the futility of accusations. The glow from the amulet dimmed, leaving behind only the softly warm light of lanterns and a lingering sense of unspoken truths. The court, caught in its own quiet absurdity, seemed to acknowledge quietly that human ironies, betrayal, suspicion, and divine signs were often the only constants in their fragile world. In this stillness, there was a gentle recognition that nothing was ever as simple as it appeared, and perhaps that was enough to keep moving forward, slowly and cautiously. As the hour waned and the hall returned to its usual quiet, the story settled into a quiet reflection, an ordinary chapter in a long human drama. The simple act of a stolen gold, a misjudged outsider, and a divine sign reminded those present that even in the grandest courts, imperfection persisted beneath the calm veneer. Human beings, after all, thrived in subtle contradictions and understated ironies. Perhaps, in acknowledging their own imperfections, they found a small comfort, a reminder that peace was, at best, a slow and uncertain journey, not a final destination. And so, the days continued in their gentle, unremarkable way. Beneath the watchful, blurred faces of gods and rulers alike, in the quiet shadows of Thebes, Khepri arrived like a faint breeze, not quite understood, but quietly tolerated. His outsider's curiosity was met with cautious glances from the court, where routines had persisted for generations beneath the watchful eyes of stone-decorated columns. The air carried a faint scent of bread dough and incense, mingling with hushed whispers. Though Khepri's presence was unremarkable to many, it held the fragile promise of change amid the slow, never-ending rhythm of court life. The moment felt like a thin thread, almost caught in the stillness of afternoon, waiting to either stretch or snap. Yet beneath the calm surface, tension quietly brewed. Khepri's attempts to understand and participate in court customs revealed subtle but persistent barriers, rituals that felt like silent riddles and gestures that carried unspoken messages of exclusion. His outsider status grew sharper with each passing day, as old traditions loomed like distant hills, unyielding to outsiders' presence. The courtier's eyes flickered with a mix of suspicion and faint amusement, their routines intact despite the faint stir of uncertainty. The weight of unvoiced disapproval settled around him like a dusty cloth, heavy and unnoticed, but unavoidable. One could sense that the court's ancient walls, though silent, bore witness to this quiet struggle of belonging versus alienation. Time unfurled with a slow, almost mocking irony, the kind that quietly hints at the futility of resistance when faced with the inertia of tradition. When the truth about Khepri's origins surfaced unexpectedly, it was almost as if the very stones of the palace had decided to whisper it aloud. The court's reaction was a faint ripple of surprise, tinged with ironic indifference, the kind of discovery that shifted nothing yet unsettled everything just enough. The pharaoh, shaded by a sudden, soft light that blurred the contours of his hidden face, seemed contemplative as he granted Khepri a pardon not as part of compassion, but as a calculated act of balance. The outsider's future was now tethered to a fragile new role. Ambassador, a word that suggested continuity and concession alike, hanging softly in the air. Khepri's departure from Thebes arrived with a quiet dignity, like the turning of a page in an understated book. His steps, slow but purposeful, carried him away from the stone corridors with their silent echoes, toward a future that was simpler in its promise, but uncertain in its meaning. As he crossed the threshold, the courtiers offered only a faint nod or a mild sideways glance, their expressions soft and unremarkable, yet somehow renewed by the knowledge that even great institutions could be humbled by humility itself. The court, now a little quieter, seemed to settle again into its ancient rhythm, the faint hum of daily life continuing without much fuss. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting long, gentle shadows over the city where time moved as slowly as the flow of history itself. In reflecting on this quiet story, one notices how the perils of intolerance often leave behind subtle scars, like the faint traces of faded paint on old walls, visible only upon close inspection. The ironies of human persistence and change are woven into these faint moments. The outsider who leaves wiser, the court that learns humility, and history that, quietly and without much fanfare, continues its gentle, enduring crawl forward. Watching from above, the faces, blurred by the soft glow of evening, seem to watch themselves as much as they watch each other, all caught in the slow dance of resilience and quiet humility. Perhaps it is in these small, unremarkable exchanges that the greatest lessons of history quietly unfold, whispering through the ages as softly as a bedtime story. In the quiet limbo of an ancient burial chamber, the recent excavation in Alexandria was met with a gentle curiosity. Layla al-Sadi, her eyes soft behind faint glasses, led her small team through the cool, stale air that drifted in from unseen cracks. The chamber's stone walls, lined with battered sarcophagi and jars of dark resin, seemed to hold their breath, waiting for discovery. There was an ordinary sense of patience in the air, nothing too hurried, just the slow unfolding of past lives. Yet beneath this calm surface, a silent warning hovered, almost like a forgotten whisper carried in the dust. As the team moved deeper, the atmosphere subtly shifted. The air grew slightly heavier, tinged with a faint, unplaceable scent, perhaps resin, perhaps something older. Layla's gloves brushed against the scraped stone as she peered into a cracked wooden coffin, and a flicker of the past seemed to almost reach out. There was a quiet tension, a reminder that beneath the surface of routine discovery, there lurked unseen dangers, diseases long dormant, but still present in the dry, confined space. A hint of irony strolled through the moment, for the very act of uncovering history also reawakened whispering hazards. In a universe that never quite promises safety, the team's atmosphere darkened with a muted, almost theatrical humor. These ancients had worked so hard to preserve themselves, and yet here they were, conspiring with death to remind the living of their fragile bodies. The resin jars, once sealing away secrets, now seemed to murmur softly of mold and bacteria, amusingly stubborn echoes of old health hazards. Layla paused, gloves tingling, as she considered the dead's final irony, that in attempting to escape disease, their mummification had preserved just enough to remind others of human vulnerability. The distant faces of unseen pharaohs blurred behind a veil of ambient light, untouchable and unknowable. Gradually, the discomfort settled into a reflective calm. The team backed out of the chamber, their footsteps slow and deliberate on the uneven floor. Outside, The warm sun seeped into the stone corridor, transforming the atmospheric gloom into a soft glow, the kind that comforts rather than alarms. Layla took a deep breath, feeling the stale air turn to a faint memory. She thought about the ancient Egyptians' meticulous care, how they aimed to glorious leave-takings, yet unknowingly crafted their own hidden risks in the process. Their silent, timeless effort whispered quietly to her. History is as much about preservation as it is about the subtle, ongoing fragility of life. In the end, the chamber's quiet reticence seemed to say more than any hurried discovery could. The old tomb, with its silent jars and battered coffins, represented a human attempt at eternity, an irony wrapped in dust and resin. Layla stepped outside into the light, her mind contemplative yet peaceful, aware of the invisible dangers that framed this centuries-old story. She recognized that somewhere between curiosity and caution lies the truth of human endeavor, a gentle acknowledgement that even in death, we are still tenderly vulnerable. With a slow smile, she closed the chamber door behind her, bowing subtly to the quiet, ancient humor of life's fleeting, fragile dance. In the quiet corners of an ancient tomb, a team of archaeologists carefully unrolled fragile linen wrappings and catalogued gilded amulets, unaware that their routine discoveries carried an almost imperceptible weight, history's slow, patient patience. As the sun dipped lower, casting a warm glow over weathered stone, there was a gentle sense of doing something both mundane and meaningful, as if touching a thread of time itself. Yet beneath this serenity, an invisible change was unfurling, a subtle vibrancy that only a few sensed in the shifting air. The air seemed slightly warmer where the oils and resins were stored, an ordinary detail that felt oddly significant now. It was as if the breath of history was exhaling quietly, waiting to reveal its next quiet secret. Gradually, that normal rhythm faltered when Layla noticed her coworker, Samuel, coughing softly and becoming more restless as they continued their work. The temperature in the small chamber seemed to increase imperceptibly, and a faint smell of musty spores drifted through the air, blending with the scent of ancient resins. As tensions grew in hushed whispers, it became clear that something unseen was awakening, an old threat disguised in relics designed for eternity. The lively hum of their routine work faded into a cautious silence, punctuated only by the soft pad of their footsteps and the rustling of papers. An irony lingered. They had crossed into the past to understand history, yet were now vulnerable to its hidden, dormant hazards. The irony was almost tangible, as if history had taken a slow, amused breath and shifted its gaze. Here they stood, paid to uncover dead things, now potentially caught in the quiet chaos of an ancient pestilence. Layla's discovery that the embalming oils harbored spores, long escaped from their sealed prison, brought a quiet humor to the despair of the situation. They had opened a sealed world, and with a whisper and a shiver, revived a threat that had outlived countless generations. Their faces, shadowed by soft light, blurred in their expressions. Was it worry or just the fatigue of centuries? No one knew for sure, only that the silent spores had become part of their story now. However briefly, it was a reminder of how fragile even the most deliberate human acts could be against the slow march of time. Calm settled over the team. A shared acceptance bloomed in the soft, flickering light of their lanterns. They moved slowly now, almost in reverence for the unseen enemy that had become part of their surroundings. The air returned to a more measured temperature, and the threat, though lingering, seemed less immediate, more like a patience that could be observed rather than fought. Layla, her face gentle and thoughtful, began to prepare disinfectants, her motions smooth and quiet, as if in prayer to the slow universe that watched silently. Though tension was still present, it was cloaked in a muted understanding, a quiet acknowledgement that some secrets prefer to stay dormant when left undisturbed. The moment became a small pause, an unspoken recognition that even history's dead-hold stories best left untold, at least for now. Later, as they descended from the tomb, the team carried with them a gentle lesson that even in the pursuit of understanding, the past was never as entirely silent or forgiving as it seemed. Their unintentional awakening of a fungal sleeping beauty echoed a truth about human imperfection. Careful, yes, but never perfect. The faint humor of their situation lingered in quiet memory, as if history itself, in its infinite patience, was reminding them to move slowly, to listen, and to accept the gentle limits of their own curiosity. The relics, now closed and protected, sat quietly in the shadowed shelves of their minds, waiting, perhaps, for the next slow, human discovery. All that remained was a lingering thought. Sometimes, the greatest danger is simply a story waiting to be told again, in the whisper of a faint, ancient breath. In the quiet sands of ancient Egypt, scholars once found themselves staring at faded hieroglyphs that told stories not just of gods and kings, but also of a curious ritual performed by embalmers. The air inside tombs was thick with a strange, earthy scent, and the silent figures of artisans hurried through their daily tasks, seemingly unaware of the danger lurking in the resin and embalming linens. Amidst the dusty, sun-warmed chambers, they believed that death could be tamed, wrapped in linen and sealed away, while while outsiders regarded the tombs with wary fascination. In their effort to preserve the body, they unknowingly created a powdery, spores-laden dust that could cause illness if disturbed. But the ancient writings, faint yet persistent, hinted that this disease was once used as a weapon, a grim safeguard for treasures hidden below the surface. As modern scholars deciphered the cryptic symbols, a tense realization settled in the spores within the ancient embalming powders had potent, deadly properties. The precise formulation was lost to time, but some inscriptions spoke of a special incense composed of rare resins and herbs that could neutralize the spores, much like an antidote from a forgotten recipe. This discovery brought a cautious hope, yet also a strange irony. A ritual designed to preserve life in death had transformed into a health hazard centuries later, waiting silently in the shadows of the tomb. The air grew still, the experts now acutely aware that every brittle bundle of linen and each jar of resin might harbor a silent threat. The story, once about preservation, now seemed also about peril, grounded in human effort and obscure knowledge. In the slow, measured testing of ancient substances, the realization dawned that it was not merely luck or superstition that kept some tombs relatively safe. Rather, it was this specific, almost forgotten incense blend that guarded against the spores. Slightly amused by the stubborn persistence of these old remedies, the researchers prepared small vials of the powder and carefully introduced tiny, controlled doses of the incense into the mix. Watching as the spores seemed to lose their aggressive shimmer, there was a certain quiet humor in fumbling through a ritual, ancient yet oddly applicable, in a lab filled with modern tools. Under the dim, flickering fluorescent lights, the scientists silently acknowledged how human ingenuity often clings to the simplest solutions, even when surrounded by complex mysteries. The irony hung softly, like dust settling after a long day's work, as the danger was contained, if only temporarily. With cautious relief, the team now reflected on the strange dance between life and death that history had woven within these sealed chambers. The aroma of the tested incense, warm, resinous, gently spiced, filled their small workspace, a reminder of human attempts to tame nature's silent, unseen enemies. As softly as dust settles on a forgotten relic, they recognized that the challenge of understanding ancient hazards required patience, humility, and a touch of humor. The idea that a simple blend of herbs could outwit a deadly spore brought a calm, almost meditative pause, as if honoring the quiet resilience of those long gone. In this slow unraveling of history's hidden threats, the story revealed that human imperfection could be both a cause of danger and its unlikely remedy, wrapped in the gentle fabric of everyday ritual and cautious curiosity. Now, as they looked back with gentle detachment, the researchers understood that beneath the solemn grandeur of tombs and the faded hieroglyphs lay stories of small human acts, crafting incense, mixing powders, carefully sealing away life and death. The risk had always been part of the journey, woven into the mundane routines of the embalmer's craft, which in turn sustained centuries of stories and myths. In the slow turning of history's pages, these hazards remind us of a simple fact: human effort is always tinged with imperfection and irony. The old embalmer's curse, with all its silent spores and ancient rituals, had quietly endured, not as a curse at all, but as a testament to human perseverance, small, imperfect, and quietly resilient in the face of the unknown. In the quiet dimness of the tomb, Layla and her assistant carefully prepared to ignite the fragrant incense, a ritual that had persisted through centuries. The air was thick with the scent of myrrh and cedar, mingling softly with the aging stone and human memory. As the thin wicks caught fire, there was a moment of shared anticipation, as if the ancients themselves watched quietly from the shadows. Yet, beneath the calm, the encased chamber held its silent, unyielding secrets as old as death itself. It was a ritual grounded in human curiosity and the fragile hope of understanding. Amid the ever-present weight of history's indifference to human frailty, suddenly the flames flickered erratically, and the incense released a sudden, unexpected gust of dense, choking fumes. The air grew heavy and oppressive as toxic vapors began to swirl through the small chamber, obscuring vision and causing coughing fits to ripple through the team. The ground beneath their feet subtly shifted, as if the tomb itself was protesting this intrusion. Tension tightened like a bowstring, and hurried whispers filled the space where silence had reigned. A race against deterioration had subtly begun. The very act of trying to breathe the past became an immediate danger, illustrating how history's silent guardians could turn hostile in an instant. There was an odd, weary irony to the situation. The true danger was not lurking within the mummified remains, but within the very tools meant to unlock their stories. Layla's efforts to continue ceremonial respect had unwittingly unleashed the protective wrath of centuries-old toxins. The calm exterior of their timed responses clashed with the trivial absurdity of human attempts to control nature's silent, ancient defenses. A shadow of a smile might have crossed her face had she time to notice, an acknowledgement that even the most careful efforts can slip into chaos over a few fleeting seconds. It was as if history watched them, bemused, aware of human hubris, wrapped in smoke and incense. Gradually, the fumes began to dissipate, and the tension in the small tomb cell softened like dusk settling on a quiet village. The team steadied themselves, their faces marked with soot and patience, as thick silence once again filled the chamber. An almost meditative stillness took hold, punctuated only by the distant creak of collapsing stone and their own calming breaths. For a moment, they were just visitors, small, imperfect humans, witnessing a grand, slow process whose true origins belonged to time itself. The air, once heavy with danger, now felt more like a memory than a threat, reminding them quietly that some mysteries prefer to stay silent and unseen. As they prepared to leave, with the tomb's secrets still whispering softly in the shadows, a sense of quiet acceptance settled over the group. History, like life, was a series of delicate balances between curiosity and caution, discovery and respect, danger and peace. The blurred faces of the unseen guardians seemed almost to smile in the dim light, as if to say that some stories should remain resting beneath the weight of eternity. In that gentle moment of reflection, the tragedy of human imperfection softened into humble understanding. We stumble forward quietly in our endless quest to make sense of what is quietly slipping away. And the tomb, with all its truths and silences, remained just that calm, eternal, and slightly amused by our futile attempts to force its secrets into the light. Long ago, in the quiet chamber of an ancient tomb, a team of explorers gently lifted the weathered lid, revealing a body wrapped in coarse linen. The air was thick with the scent of dust and old stone, an almost imperceptible chill hinting at the passage of centuries. As they carefully documented the scene, it was clear that human curiosity had led them here, seeking stories far beyond the reach of ordinary life. Yet, unaware of the silent hazards resting inside this sealed space, the tomb's silence was profound, broken only by the soft whisper of their notes and the faint scrape of tools on rough surfaces. It was an act of quiet discovery, tinged with a faint, ironic sense that what they sought might also be what they would inadvertently bring back. As the team prepared to close the chamber once more, their faces showed a mix of awe and caution. Some understood, even if only subconsciously, that ancient diseases could cling to these remains like stubborn shadows. Their reports detailed not just the grandeur of funerary art or artifacts, but also the subtle signs of microbial presence, dark patches, and dried residues that seemed almost harmless in the broad daylight of modern science. Yet beneath their calm exterior, an unspoken tension lingered, a recognition that sealing the tomb might also mean containing unseen biological hazards. The irony was quiet but sovereign. In their haste to preserve history, they might be trapping invisible threats with little regard for what the sealed air could still carry. Modern medicine had moved on, but the tiny, forgotten dangers still made their silent, dusty claims. Decades later, when curious visitors ventured into the tombs, the story of hidden health hazards was an unspoken part of the narrative, whispered as an ironic footnote in the guidebooks. They marveled at the carved hieroglyphs and the fragile beauty of mummified figures, often with a blink of humor at the thought that what remained might have been more alive than it seemed, infected relics waiting patiently. Even through time, a muted awareness grew that some specimens, though silent, still carried diseases capable of stirring uncomfortable coughing fits or mild fevers. The guards and curators, with their measured steps and half-hearted warning smiles, knew that curiosity must be tempered with caution, an old lesson slipping through the cracks of modern routine. In their calm, pragmatic way, they simply adjusted protocols, quietly acknowledging history's ongoing, if understated, lesson in human vulnerability. Today, the protocols at these ancient sites are slightly more refined: gloves, masks, and careful handling, now woven into the quiet rhythm of preservation. Visitors are gently reminded that beneath the centuries of dust, some danger still lingers, an almost amusing thought, as if the dead were still guarding their secrets with a stubborn persistence. The air inside feels cooler, slightly sterile, a new boundary between past and present. The process of inspection and documentation now moves with a patience born of experience, unhurried, respectful, always mindful of what might be lingering just out of sight. This calm adaptiveness is a humble acknowledgement that history is layered and alive in ways not always visible, but quietly real. The ancient dead, after all, still command a humble reverence, even in their silent, dusty repose. In the stillness of these moments, one can reflect on the layered human story, our relentless desire to understand, to preserve, and yet sometimes to confront what we do not fully grasp. The fragile boundary between curiosity and caution remains a gentle, ongoing dialogue, an acceptance that some knowledge comes at a modest, quiet cost. Perhaps the best we can do is to honor both the past and the present, holding in mind that even in death, humans have left behind not just stories and relics, but also lessons about our cautious, imperfect dance with the unknown. As the softly light filters through cracks in the stone, it is clear that every breath inside this silent world carries both a whisper of history and a reminder of human fragility. In the slow unfolding of time, there's a certain peaceful ongoingness an enduring, if slightly ironic, hum of life's quiet persistence. In the quiet morning of Thebes, Neferu, a diligent scribe, noticed a strange gap in the temple's grain storeroom. The air was still, and the only sound was the faint tapping of his reed brush on papyrus, marking a routine day that suddenly felt uncertain. As he examined the shelves, a faint sense of unease curled in his stomach. Someone had taken a handful of grain, enough to be noticed, but not enough to cause immediate alarm. The temple's rigid hierarchy meant that such thefts were rarely dismissed. The weight of mad, the concept of cosmic justice, pressed gently yet insistently on his mind. With measured steps, he decided to report his finding, knowing that the looming figure of the vizier would soon weigh in on the matter. As was tradition in the slow march of justice, it was an ordinary shift with an unspoken reminder that even in order, mistakes and human imperfection persisted beneath the surface. Later that day, the vizier's officials arrived, their sandals quiet against the clay floors, the flickering light casting long shadows across the stone walls. Neferu recounted his discovery, his voice calm, but edged with the faint weight of expectation. The officials, dressed in simple linen, moved deliberately, their faces obscured by the soft haze of midday sunlight filtering through narrow windows. The investigation began with careful counting of grain and questions about any unusual activity around the storeroom. Procedures as predictable as the Nile's annual flood. Still, beneath the surface of routine, an unspoken tension lingered. What if the theft was a symptom of something deeper? The process was slow, almost respectful in its quiet certainty, for punishment was bound to follow if the guilty were found. Yet the ritual of inquiry seemed almost perfunctory, a somber dance between order and human frailty. As the detectives examined the grain and interviewed others, irony crept in like a gentle breeze. What seemed like a small act carried the weight of cosmic balance. The officials' faces, blurred by the warm sunset glow, imparted no judgment, only the quiet duty of uncovering truth. Neferu watched the slow unfoldment of the case, aware that the punishment would be strict, perhaps a public reprimand, or a simple warning, mortal consequences in a world governed by divine principles. It struck him as mildly humorous how serious everyone was about grain theft, a petty crime that felt almost symbolic of a larger, more tangled sense of morality. Still, life moved on, and the routine continued, emphasizing that justice in these times, while stern, was also an act of gentle waiting for human errors to reveal themselves, unhurried and inevitable. By late afternoon, the investigation concluded, and a quiet decision was made. The guilty party, an unremarkable servant, was gently summoned, and with soft words and a firm glance, reprimanded. The law's simplicity was striking. A small theft met with a proportionate punishment, ensuring that balance, like Mad's feather, remained undisturbed. As the officials departed, and the servant bowed his head in quiet acknowledgement, the scene settled into a calm that felt like the unchanging scroll of history itself. Neferu, watching the proceedings with a gentle sense of melancholy, reflected how human flaws were woven into the fabric of daily life, always kept in check by a distant, ever-watchful divine order. It was, after all, just grain, yet so much more in the slow, steady rhythm of justice. As evening descended over Thebes, the temple returned to its quiet watch, the story of the theft fading into memory, like the last flickers of sunlight on the stone. Neferu closed his scroll, the wax seal faintly clinging to the edges, and felt the familiar weight of routine settle back into his shoulders. The law had spoken, swift and unembellished, maintaining a fragile harmony that sustained the city's quiet, unhurried rhythm. In this simple tale, beneath layers of bureaucracy and divine expectation, there was a gentle reminder. Human imperfection persisted, but so did the hope for balance, not through harshness, but through steady, patient order. And as the lamps flickered softly against the wall, the city sank into its usual calm, lulled by the slow, inevitable flow of justice and the quiet hum of everyday life. In a quiet corner of Thebes, beneath the fading light filtering through narrow windows, Neferu's voice carried softly as she recounted the days when Kem, a humble laborer, was suddenly summoned to face judgment. It was a routine morning, punctuated only by the faint scrape of his sandals on the stone floor. Yet that day had begun to ripple with an almost unnoticed gravity. The court officials, dressed in linen and leather, sat in stiff rows, their eyes often drifting away from the low-ranking man who now stood trembling slightly. Little did Kem know that his small, seemingly insignificant mistake would set a slow chain of accusations into motion, an ordinary day laced with the quiet patience of justice. And so, with a faint rustle of papyrus, the process of questioning arose amidst the worn but unwavering stones of the courtroom. As Kem answered the scribe's questions, the air seemed to thicken with unspoken concerns, shadows flickering across faces etched with the fatigue of daily responsibilities. Rumors had begun to circulate, perhaps of corruption, perhaps of favoritism, making the room feel heavier with suspicion. A whisper about some missing tools, or perhaps money, floated along the edges of the gathering, like a ghost softly passing through cracks in the plaster. Every word Kem uttered was met with a mixture of bored indifference and cautious curiosity by those who watched, waiting for the inevitable verdict that hung just beyond reach. The tension grew translucent, like the dust motes suspended in the waning light, settling over everyone's minds with a slow, inevitable weight. In the quiet, irony peeked through with a subtle smile as the judge, a man known for his unshakable stoicism, glanced at the accused, and then at the court officials who seemed too accustomed to the harshness of it all. The official record, written in steady script, documented not just the allegations, but the anxious pauses between, when a sigh might have escaped unnoticed. Somewhere behind the curtains of the room, unseen, the faces of prophets or revered figures remained hidden, their features blurred by shadow or light, perhaps indifferent or simply resigned to the endless cycle of accusation. Kem's fate, entangled in rumors and fear, was already sealed in that quiet moment of unremarked irony. Justice, in its slow and measured way, was carried out with the same patience as a sunset slipping beyond the horizon. The whole affair was a reminder of how easily human fault might become a matter of recorded history, left to drift like the dust in the corners. In the stillness that followed, the court's decision was announced in a subdued voice, an echo in the large, bare room. The thick silence stretched on as Kem lowered his gaze, the weight of formal sentence settling in like a quiet rain. The harshness of the system was all too familiar, yet somehow the calm that enveloped the scene made it feel more like a ritual than a punishment. Outside, the usual sounds of daily life slowly crept back, the distant scrape of a cart, the murmur of merchants. But inside, everything moved with an almost gentle routine. The rumors, the anxiety, the ironclad laws, they all rested quietly, waiting for another ordinary day to begin. In that calm, one sensed that perhaps, beneath the layers of severity, there was a strange, enduring patience in the ancient rhythm of justice that persisted beyond the moment's tempests. Reflecting on the day's events, it seemed to reveal a quiet truth about human imperfection, that even amid strict laws and severe punishments, life in Thebes gently carried on, largely unnoticed. The dust settled again on old stone walls, and the faces blurred by shadow and light faded into familiar routines. Perhaps Kem would serve his time, perhaps not. The details of punishment drifted into the background of everyday stories, much like the unremarkable yet meaningful moments that mark human history. As Neferu's softly spoken account drew to a close, there was a gentle acknowledgement that justice, in its slow, muted way, was more about enduring the process than about reaching a certain end. And so, in the slow passage of days, the city moved forward, quietly, imperfectly, humanly, aware, perhaps, of its own enduring patience. In the quiet stillness of the Egyptian court, the trial began as the vizier Ankheper settled onto his carved wooden throne. The flickering torchlight casting long shadows on the sandstone walls. Kem, the accused, stood upright, hands trembling slightly, eyes cast downward, awaiting what he knew would be a slow progression of stern interrogations. The witnesses sat on simple stools, their faces mostly blurred by the soft light, listening intently as the officials prepared their questions, questions that hinted, perhaps intentionally, at the truth's elusive nature. Outside, the faint hum of a distant market and the whisper of wind through papyrus reeds seemed oddly disconnected from the gravity of what was about to unfold. It was a ritual as old as the stones their society was built upon, the solemn search for justice in a land where order often meant silence and severity. As the vizier's steward stepped forward, the tone shifted. Kem was suddenly seized, his arms pulled forcefully, the rough hemp of a flogging whip cracking softly in the cool air. The pain was only partly felt. More piercing was the pressure to confess, to reveal the truth buried under layers of fear and fatigue. The vizier stared at him, his eyes inscrutable, as harsh words were pressed into Kem's ears, and the crowd watched with expressions that seemed a little weary themselves, tired of the drama, but compelled to see justice done. The air grew dense with the smell of sweat and dust, and the little sounds of movement whispered commands. Shifting feet drifted through the courtroom like leaves on the Nile. All the while, the sacred unspoken rule persisted. Truth was a fragile thing, sometimes coaxed, sometimes wrestled from the silence. A moment of irony settled over the proceedings as Kem, faced with relentless pressure, finally offered a confession, though how truthful it was, no one could say. The vizier nodded slowly, a faint smile touching his eyes for a fleeting second, as if amused by the ritual's predictability. The crowd's reactions ranged from mild curiosity to a quiet sense of resignation. Humans repeating roles they knew too well, caught between justice and mere appearance. The harshness lingered in the air. The threat of amputation or branding had become almost a background hum, a reminder of the weight that was carried in every verdict. The scene unfolded in a strange, quiet rhythm, an ancient dance of authority and obedience, where human imperfections and the desire for order quietly intertwined. After the formalities, the courtroom gradually slowed, the tension easing into a fragile calm. Kem was led away, his shoulders slumped, but his face calm, perhaps resigned to whatever fate had been sealed. Outside, the guards returned to their positions, and the crowd dispersed slowly, their faces softer now, less driven by outrage or fear, more by a kind of weary acceptance. The distant murmur of voices and footsteps blended into the background sounds of daily life, reasserting itself. Nothing overtly extraordinary, just the gentle continuation of routine in a world that moved with unhurried purpose. In the subdued light, the stones seemed to watch quietly, as if they, too, had grown tired of the endless cycle of accusations and judgments. The scene closed in a gentle hush, hinting at the slow, steady persistence of human flaws amid the quest for order. In the quiet of that evening, one could reflect on the strange stillness of justice in ancient Egypt, how its stern simplicity belied the gentle hum of human complexity beneath. The faces seen, blurred and shadowed, carried stories of fear, hope, and resignation, stories that had unfolded quietly for centuries. The courtroom was a small, imperfect stage where humanity's search for meaning played out in slow gestures and measured words. Though the methods seemed harsh, they reflected a deep desire for stability, perhaps a kind of silent acknowledgement that human justice, like all things, was neither perfect nor simple. And so, life in the shadows of the city moved on, patiently enduring the slow, unspoken rhythms of human imperfection, like a gentle river flowing past ancient stones, calm, enduring, quietly amused by its own persistence. In the quiet chambers of the ancient Egyptian palace, the case finally arrived, carried on the shoulders of scribes and officials who prowled the cool stone corridors. The accused, a man whose face wore a weariness that seemed too familiar to be angry or ashamed, sat quietly, awaiting the verdict beneath the flickering light of oil lamps. The pharaoh, seated on his throne with a serene, yet distant gaze, listened carefully as voices recounted the details. The dry sound of papyrus pages turning almost blending into the hushed air. With slow, deliberate words, the ruler invoked Mad, the universal order of truth and justice, and pronounced a severe punishment, branding and exile. It was an ordinary act of justice, yet carried with it the weight of centuries, and the quiet expectation that human imperfections could be weighed and tempered by rule and ritual. As the court's murmur dimmed into silence, a subtle tension arose, an unseen thread of doubt that clung to the air like dust. A hidden figure, cloaked softly in shadow behind the gathering, leaned slightly forward, whispering a quiet suggestion of clemency. The words, fragile and hesitant, drifted like a feather across the stone floors, suggesting perhaps a softer path, some mercy amid the harsh decree. The pharaoh's eyes flicked toward the invisible voice, the weight of his judgment pressing down in a calm but palpable pause. Here, The machinery of law met the quiet whisper of mercy, creating a fragile crossroads in a system built on unforgiving tradition. The moment seemed suspended, like still water waiting for the smallest ripple to break its surface. The irony of the scene lay in its quiet ordinariness. The judge, the accused, the whisperer, all human figures caught in a slow dance of authority and doubt. The pharaoh's hand hovered momentarily, as if stretching to decide. The soft creak of the throne filling the room with a gentle tension. Outside, the breeze floated through tiny windows, carrying the faint scent of crushed papyrus and baked earth. The official record kept its cool, distant voice echoing, while the hidden voice remained unseen, its face obscured by a veil of shadow and light. The moderator's voice, wrapped in calm, brought the verdict close. The branding would mark. The exile would begin. Yet, somewhere behind the controlled expression, a faint hint of hesitation persisted. What if mercy had a quiet place in justice's long, silent hall? After the decision, there was a hush that felt both peaceful and inevitable, as if the moment had simply settled into its quiet routine. The man, now branded with a scar, stood in silence, the roughness of his punishment plain against his skin. The exile awaited beyond the palace walls, a journey into the unknown that was perhaps more burdensome than the mark itself. The pharaoh, still seated, looked out over the court with a calm detachment, his face half shaded, as if the resolution had drained from his features. The quiet hum of daily life continued outside, workers moving slowly, children's distant laughter, the faint murmur of water over stones, highlighting how ordinary this act truly was in the grand cycle of justice and human frailty. And yet, in that calm, something quietly lingered. The unspoken question of what mercy might still quietly hide beneath the surface of law. Now, as history settled into its quiet years, the scene remains in its timeless stillness, a testament to human systems that tried to balance fairness and order with soft irony. The pharaoh's judgment, simple yet profound, serves as a slow reminder that even in the midst of strict routines, the faint whisper of mercy can find a hollow in the stone walls of authority. The accused, marked but free to carry on, walks slowly into the next chapter of his life, under the watchful yet indifferent gaze of history. It is a human story, one of imperfect justice, fleeting mercy, and quiet acceptance that, like all stories, waits patiently in the shadows of time, softly amused by the subtlety of human choice. Long ago, in the quiet halls of ancient Egypt, the justice system carried a weight that seemed to settle like dust on old papyrus. Kem, a modest farmer, found himself summoned before the silent judge's bench, surrounded by scribes whose eyes flickered over clay tablets. The courtroom was a low space, filled with the subtleties of small gestures, eyes cast down, hands hesitating on the edge of their robes, each motion humming with the unspoken expectation of order. It was an ordinary morning turned momentous, where ancient laws felt both stern and inevitable, whispering through the thick air. Life, like justice, moved slowly, with a quiet certainty that punishment awaited the slightest misstep, whether by deed or by fate. As the proceedings unfolded, a tension wove itself through the room, thickening like the midday heat crawling along the sandstone walls. Kem's voice, when he finally spoke, was soft, almost lost beneath the rhythmic scratching of reed pens. The judges, faces shaded by flickering oil lamps, maintained a calm stiffness, their eyes motionless behind veils of shadow, listening for the faintest hint of remorse or rebellion. The verdict was whispered, a sound like distant wind sliding across the Nile Delta, as if the very weight of justice wanted to be heard without disturbance. The penalties, cruel yet calculated, unfolded in slow, measured tones, echoing ancient observations that order often danced dangerously close to cruelty. In a strange twist of irony, Kem's fate, marked by simple acts that had become symbols, seemed almost mundane in the heavy quiet of the judgment. The act of a careless word, a forgotten vow, suddenly transformed into a knot too tight to undo, a punishment meted out with a calm that contrasted sharply with the chaos it left behind. The officials, busy with their daily routines of weighing justice, appeared unaffected by the human fragility before them. Their faces, blurred by the flickering shadows of oil lamps, seemed almost like husks of empathy, detached from the concrete feeling of human error. It was an ordinary spectacle, bones of law stretched taut, yet it carried the quiet irony that laws designed to uphold order could so effortlessly wrap around human weakness. After the judgments, life in the village resumed its gentle pace, as if the echoes of justice had quietly settled into the background hum of daily tasks. Kem was led away, his shoulders bowed, hands clasped, while the sun cast a warm glow over the irregular footprints in dirt that told stories of small tragedies. Neferu, a neighbor who had watched in silence, sat underneath a tamarisk tree, pondering the fine line between order and brutality. The soft murmur of wind through papyrus fields seemed to acknowledge the quiet persistence of memory, how punishment becomes part of life's slow ripple rather than its abrupt wave. And so, the terrible weight of justice faded into the endless patience of time, leaving only subdued footprints in the dust. Now, in the calm of reflection, Neferu often thought about the silent balance The ancient justice system maintained a balance that forever echoed in the stories passed down through generations. The law, with its roots sunk deep into the bedrock of civilization, had always carried within it a subtle irony. That order sometimes must be maintained with a touch of cruelty. As the shadows lengthened and the stars prepared to appear, the past seemed distant, yet intimately close. A quiet reminder that human flaws and the search for justice are threads woven into the fabric of history. Perhaps, in the end, the legacy of those old laws was less about punishment and more about teaching patience in a world of imperfect humans, softly reverberating through time like a gentle, eternal hum.